Hey, I'm starting a little bit late today, but I am not lost on what is going on. Hey, I'm starting. Oh God. Oh God. So loud. I need to mute it on the other screen. So right now we are looking at the counter UAS issues. This is a subcommittee brought together by parts of the FAA and government to basically talk about issues surrounding drones and how to combat them. This is a public kind of session, meaning they broadcast it live on the internet. And these are people that are basically deciding how drones are going to be integrated into our airspace going forward and how they might combat them. So this is a really important talk. It's a really important discussion, and it's something that people really need to know about. A link for the actual live stream is in the description, so if you want to watch it in its entirety without my commentary, again, link in the description. But this is about my commentary and what I think about the whole issue and all that good stuff. So I don't have the audio muted right now. They actually had an audio issue. So the first part of the broadcast, they had no audio, which is very disappointing because it's basically like, what are they saying? So I'm going to say the guy right here, he's Mr. Turtle. We have Mr. Suit and Mr. Tie. I'm just going to say those are the three dudes. We have, I'm trying to read their actual names. The video quality is so bad, like I can't even pick out their names on the cards. So that's also really kind of a sad thing. They broadcast it in 480p. They weren't even broadcasting in 720, people. Okay, enough of me ranting about that. Let me see if I can find out where they start talking so we can actually like hear about what they're doing and what they're saying. Oh, this is disappointing. The whole beginning of it is just completely silent. Okay, whoever was running the streaming for this event, you should be fired. You were getting paid to make sure that this was streamed, and you had no audio. What the heck? What the absolute heck? How can we have a democracy if we can't, you know, talk about this stuff? There's a lot of people in that room. There's a lot of people for the subcommittee meeting. Holy crap. I'm fast forwarding to try to find a spot where we can hear them talk. Wow, a lot of important stuff is being said that we can't hear. Wow, almost half the video is without audio. That is insanity.
Have the ability to ID.
Oh, no, that was me.
36 of the 2012
Technologies may call
of UAS.
Okay. Almost there, people. Almost there.
Departments of Defense and of UAS.
Who was the special assistant to the...
Okay, so right around here they get audio back.
Who was the special assistant to the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Defense Integration and Defense Support of Civil Authorities, Department of Defense. Say that 3 times fast.
Okay.
Mr.
You stole my joke!
President of Civil Aviation Aerospace Industries Association. Of Mr. Doug Johnson, Vice President for Technology, Policy, and Consumer Technology Association. And we have Ms. Lisa Ellman, Co-Executive Director of the Commercial Drone Alliance. So with that, Angela, would you like to kick off?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, Chairman Lobiondo, Ranking Member DeFazio, and Ranking Member Larson, and members of the committee. I appreciate being invited to speak today. As you know, the proliferation of UAS and the development of unmanned systems technology generates both excitement and concern, as all of you have stated.
Excitement and concern, people. So much concern.
As a tool for moving consumer goods, responding to disasters, and removing people from otherwise dangerous work is tremendous. But we recognize the misuse of this technology poses unique security challenges.
Who's misusing it?
These concerns, Congress granted the Departments of Defense and Energy the authorities necessary to counter UAS threats over their most sensitive facilities and assets.
Okay, that's understandable.
So, Congress directed DoD and DOE to coordinate closely with the FAA to ensure any collateral effects on air navigation services or onboard aircraft systems can be mitigated without compromising aviation safety. This coordination is vital, it is extensive, and it is ongoing as we work to support deployment of counter-UAS technology to protect critical DoD and DOE facilities and assets across the United States. However,
so they're more concerned about protecting critical assets than they are about taking down drones. But it still starts with new regulations and laws that allow them to do that.
Legislative relief from Title 18 and other statutes is required.
Just saying that. They're literally just saying that.
To mitigate security threats posed by errant or hostile UAS. Implementation of these authorities requires a thoughtful, coordinated approach in order to balance our security partners' protective missions with the FAA's responsibility to preserve safe and efficient airspace access for legitimate users. While FAA believes it can successfully work across the executive branch to safely implement such grants of authority, it is important to highlight 3 related policies that will greatly reduce the instances of hazardous UAS operations while enhancing the effectiveness of our security partners' efforts to counter them when necessary. Universal requirements for UAS registration, remote identification, and compliance with basic airspace rules are necessary conditions for safe and secure UAS integration. The current exemption for model aircraft, Section 336 of the FAA Modernization and Reform Act of 2012, is the fundamental barrier to effective implementation of these policy changes and presents an insurmountable challenge to the FAA and our national defense, homeland security, and law enforcement partners as we work to enable the benefits of UAS technology while maintaining safety and security for the American people. I thank the committee for its leadership on this issue and will be happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. Stephen?
Chairman Lombiando, Ranking Member DeFazio, and Ranking Member Larson, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the issues relating to the use of counter-UAS technologies and the safety and security challenges the Department of Defense is addressing and responding to the threat posed by the malicious use of unmanned aircraft systems in the United States. I want to make 3 points, or a few points right up front. 1, the UAS threat to DoD installations operations in the homeland is real and increasing. DoD is working to mitigate this threat amidst a complex legal environment. DoD is proceeding deliberately in close cooperation with the FAA and other federal partners to implement its legal authorities to counter these UAS threats. And also, DoD supports the enactment of similar counter-UAS authorities to enable DHS and...
So they just said the DoD wants to make their own civil authorities to take on drone use. So they're possibly talking about a whole new branch of government.
Easier to use and more durable. These factors make UAS increasingly attractive as a platform for criminal and other malicious surveillance, harassment, disruption, smuggling.
It makes a great platform for everything.
For the Senate Appropriations Committee, this is becoming an increasing problem. But amidst this threat, we have challenges, and DoD's
adding new laws are not going to stop that threat.
Regulatory environment. First, it's classified as an aircraft. Do
you really think a criminal is going to say, hey, I'm going to stop flying now because you have a law? Oh, I'm sorry. No, they're going to keep doing it anyways. The only thing the laws are going to affect are law-abiding citizens who are not creating issues in the airspace.
Violate several provisions of federal law. Moreover, some UAS technologies may cause collateral effects, including interfering with the legitimate use of electromagnetic spectrum and access to GPS. DoD works to mitigate the risk of these collateral consequences through extensive testing of potential counter-UAS technologies and extensive coordination with the FAA.
I'm for that. We do need some counter technologies at sensitive locations. That I understand.
We appreciate the work.
But tying it into laws is not what we should do.
FY17 and FY18, and we look forward to continued dialogue on how we can properly implement these things in a productive manner into the U.S. national airspace. Thank you for the opportunity before today to talk to this roundtable and this policy discussion. I appreciate your leadership, Chairman Lobiondo. As a person who grew up in South Jersey, I appreciate your leadership. We're a township native.
Oh, what a kiss ass! There's someone who grew up in South Jersey.
Egg Harbor Township. Absolutely. So, I participated in sports with Bridgeton High School.
Okay.
Oh my God! What a kiss ass!
Certainly look forward to your questions today.
Okay. Thank you, Stephen. David, you're up.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman Lobiondo, Ranking Member Larson, Ranking Member DeFazio, and other members of the committee. AIA represents Sure, absolutely. AIA, we represent over 340 manufacturers in the aerospace and defense industry, including most of our members make the avionics and the aircraft itself. So this is a very critical issue for us, and we appreciate you taking the time to cover it with us today. We at AIA absolutely support the need for law enforcement to mitigate drone threats. But as these efforts ramp up and the increasing usage of drones within the aerospace, it is important to seek input from the users and stakeholders of the aerospace. We have the experience, we have many years working in these fields, radiative fields, high intensity radiative fields, electromagnetic interference, EMI. We've done a lot of work hardening our aircraft, and what we don't want to do is introduce any new risks that we are not prepared for. So taking time to do this correctly, as Ranking Member Larson pointed out in conjunction with the FAA, is critical, I think, to all of us in achieving the universal goal of protecting the national airspace.
So is the national airspace system not protected right now? Seriously, what is the problem?
Impacts to current commercial and civil aerospace needs. What we don't want to accidentally do is shut down an airport. So these are important considerations as we move forward. And once again, like other of the panelists, I would like to thank the committee for its leadership in this area and the opportunity to talk to you today. I look forward to answering your questions.
Okay. Thank you, David. Doug?
So these guys clearly have an agenda.
Members of the committee for the opportunity to be here on behalf of the Consumer Technology Association.
Hey, our one guy in
to
our
borrow
wing.
a phrase that I think Ms. Stubblefield used at the last FAA symposium, looking at counter-UAS holistically, from the operator standpoint, there are the careless, the clueless, and the criminal. Okay, so two of those can be addressed through education initiatives and improved efforts on that front.
Hey,
and
someone that's finally starting to
that,
speak some sense.
in a couple of different
Thank
ways,
God.
including the Know Before You Fly campaign, but also targeted outreach to younger operators. Regarding criminal behavior, we certainly support the federal government's efforts on that front. We hear from our members about their concerns as these counter-UAS technologies are explored, about the importance of protecting personal privacy and confidential business information. I would also note the implementation of Section 2209 regarding critical infrastructure is very important. We still don't have that. There's been a piecemeal approach to that at the state and local level to date. We're looking for an organized approach. Regarding drones themselves, our industry supports and is contributing to a remote identification solution. A few years ago, we developed an industry standard for serial numbers for drones. We participated in the UAS ID ARC. We are now working on a standard for remote identification, which is obviously a fundamental in the context of counter-UAS. We think it's also important to recognize the distinctions between the more capable and less capable drones. This distinction was drawn in the remote ID ARC. We think it's also consistent with the views expressed during that ARC by the law enforcement and security communities. Finally, the consumer drone industry stands ready to contribute solutions to address security concerns. The detection and identification technologies are built into consumer drones in many cases.
Yeah, I gotta say, it's pretty disgusting that they don't have anybody representing the community there. This is everybody on basically the commercial side and the law enforcement side.
But the remote ID technologies and identification means are not. It should be perfectly legal for authorities to detect and decode these signals, and to the extent that the legal authority is not clear, it should be made clear. Thank you very much, and I look forward to answering your questions.
So we're talking about having authorities with the ability to intercept your drone signals to find out what it's doing and where it's at.
This is the committee. We're here because drones are critical to our future. Technology has surged ahead, and drones are now powerful tools for all vertical sectors of our economy. On behalf of key commercial drone industry players, the Commercial Drone Alliance works to educate, because while innovation has moved quickly forward, our laws and policies have lagged behind. For the commercial drone industry to safely take off and benefit the American public, we need a systematic framework enabling development of highways in the sky, just like we have for cars and airplanes. Properly tailored counter-drone authorities are important, and we have many thoughts on this, including around protecting authorized commercial drone operations and privacy. But for this framework to succeed, we need simultaneous reform of Section 336 of the 2012 Act to enable the FAA to implement very basic rules of the road, including remote ID, for all UAS operators. Without this reform, there's no ability to tell friend from foe. The federal government has therefore held back the commercial drone industry, and innovation suffers. This reform is important today to automate low altitude drone
some good
operations,
stuff.
but also for tomorrow to enable the future of automated human air transportation. I applaud this committee for trying to enable this exciting future in a way that is safe and secure, and I look forward to your
words. I
questions.
think she's trying to trick us with her
Thank you.
words.
Stephen, you referenced the close working
I'm
relationship
hearing some
with
double
FAA.
speak.
Could you and Angela, maybe can you give us an idea of what that looks like, that working together, how closely, et cetera?
Absolutely. From the time, sir, that we started the process of implementing the authority granted by Congress, we have worked closely in the policy that was established with FAA. We coordinated fully on all associated actions with our counter UAS capability that we would be employing before we even implemented anything. So it was a process right from the start where we engaged directly in the planning process before implementation. And then through implementation, we've worked closely as we've tested and looked at the capabilities that would employ at our DoD installations throughout the United States with FAA at a site-specific look based on the capabilities we'll employ and also the effects it could have in that particular airspace. And we continue that dialogue regularly.
I would really love to fly a tiny loop through the room right now.
Establish a mechanism where every 2 weeks we meet recurringly just to talk about issues associated with counter UAS implementation between the Department of Defense and FAA. So we conduct implementation in a way that introduces our counter UAS capabilities in a very safe manner into the national airspace. That's the goal. We want to do that, and we continue to work with them daily to do so.
Do you have anything to add, Angela?
Yes, sir. And Steve probably wishes he only heard from me every 2 weeks. It's actually a dialogue that goes on almost daily regarding the efforts for DOD and the Department of Energy as well to deploy counter UAS technology at their sites across the country.
So they're talking about this on the daily, guys.
The first grant of authority was given in the NDAA in December of 2015. In January of 2016, in December of 2016. In January of 2017, we began defining what threat meant, which was sort of the first requirement of the NDAA. And from there, it has been, like I said, daily or weekly contact to work through every facet from understanding the concept of operations, from understanding the impacts and the...
So they spend a good deal of their life trying to figure out what drones were.
Training that is ongoing with the folks on the ground who are actually pushing the buttons, so to speak, looking at spectrum analysis.
I push buttons. I'm a button pusher.
There's appropriate flight restrictions in place such that this technology is only used in locations where UAS and unmanned aircraft are not operating to, again, make sure we're minimizing those collateral effects. We have reporting and notification requirements wherein DOD makes notification to the FAA as soon as operationally feasible once a technology system has been used, and then periodically until the conclusion of any given incident where they're engaging.
No, they are all trying very hard to sound smart and educated about what they're talking about, and it makes them sound so fucking stupid as someone who knows what's up.
It's a marriage, not dating. When you bring this into the National Airspace System, the FAA is your partner going forward.
That's
and that
true.
has certainly been the case with DOD and DOE, and certainly as we've worked to try to support DHS and Justice pursuing similar authorities, they have committed to very similar commitment to working with us very closely, because our job is to ensure that as we bring this critical technology in to face threats, we are not creating in its place a safety risk for our legitimate users.
What the fuck did she
David,
just
can
say?
you give us any specific instances of radio wave technology interfering with commercial airliners?
Thank you. So yes, sir. I mean, there have been instances where we have lost due to radio waves. We believe that we've lost autopilot in a couple of instances in a couple of airports. Some of them, I was talking yesterday with someone. Recently, we actually had a grocery store door opening and shutting that was resulting in the shutdown of the. So it's obvious.
Remember, grocery store doors are more dangerous to the airspace system than drones.
And spectrum is along with that. So we have a lot of concerns anytime we start talking about the use of jamming technology. as to the intentional and unintentional use, right? With the inverse law, square rule, you fire something into the sky, whether it's a radio wave, it's going to continue on for a long, long time. It just dissipates over time. So without understanding how those radio frequency waves are going to affect the aircraft, we put the aircraft at risk. Now,
first and foremost, the aircraft should not be affected by those radio waves in the first place. And if you can take down a plane by shooting some radio waves at it, that is a problem.
Have done, and there are processes for us to go ahead and evaluate that, but that's critical.
Oh, I'm losing my shit.
Time to do it. One other thing is, if we are attempting to block or jam or disrupt UAS using GPS blocking and jamming technology, we definitely want to make sure that we're talking about jamming, not spoofing, because spoofing could result in pilots getting bad information and making decisions as a result of it. So at AIA, we feel very strongly that, again, this is all done in good consultation with us so that we can make the right decisions.
Thank you. Peter?
So they're talking about GPS spamming to basically
thanks, Mr. Chairman.
shut down the GPS system.
Ask, is there,
that's not going to work all that well.
Anybody on the panel who believes that we don't need to modify Section 336 so the FAA can impose some requirements on model aircraft? Okay, I don't see any disagreement there. Okay.
No one's going to agree with you.
From that,
no one said anything during anyone else's speaking.
As Mr. Silver was just pointing out, what technologies might we authorize for counter drone use, and how might they affect the national airspace and the safety of commercial aviation and legitimate operation of drones or commercial drones by either hobbyists or commercial entities. So I know, Ms. Stubblefield, that there's a recently published report on counter UAS by the FAA that says a large proportion of counter UAS systems actively marketed to U.S. government customers do not perform at a satisfactory level.
Yeah, they suck.
And then the Joint Improvised Threat Defeat Organization said threat targets were very resilient against damage. Would you care?
No, they're not resilient against damage. The systems just suck.
In terms of being able to discriminate. I mean, first now we can't discriminate because we don't know, who's operating these things. But to remove drones in a discriminate and safe way, what's the most promising technology, do you think, at this point?
Thank you, sir. So just to your point about discrimination, that is correct. Until we have some form of remote identification that applies universally to all UAS operating in the national airspace system, right now, every UAS that's in a place it shouldn't be looks to our security partners as a potential threat. And certainly as we look at then moving to how do you detect,
so remember, flying a UAS is like basically carrying a gun around,
those are the types
and while you look around,
technology
you think it's a threat.
Categorized in this space. There is a lot of technology out there. I think a recent BARD study said there's 230 products from 150 vendors in 20 countries. So there's a lot that's out there. The vast majority of it is based on military technology. And that military technology has not really been adequately tested in civil environments. Now, the FAA, in response to...
She's talking about military technology in civil areas. What the hell?
Direction from Congress in the 2016 reauthorization bill under Section 2206 did conduct a pilot study at 4 different airports. Atlantic City was our first. We also worked with the FBI at JFK, Denver International, and Dallas-Fort Worth to take a sampling of what we thought were the most technically ready technologies for detection. And we evaluated them in the airport environment. And the airport environment is a highly densely populated interference environment. And different types of technologies. We have everything from radar to electrical, optical, infrared, to the radio frequency that was described.
Lasers. They need to use freaking lasers. That's the only thing that would work across the board for different drones, because all of them operate on different frequencies and you can't jam all the frequencies all the time, realistically, in my mind. So, detect where they are, laser shoot them out of the sky. We have lasers. You can do it. It's not that hard.
Earlier, acoustic. There's a variety of different types of technologies out there. Each of them has their limitations and their advantages. In the airport environment, each of them found challenges. And in particular, when we think about the airport environment, which is where the FAA was focused, the vast majority of the UAS sightings that are identified are taking place 3 nautical miles or more from the airport. So the range of this technical capability to identify something that far out, to discriminate it properly, is challenged.
I don't think any of these people fly drones.
When our partners are looking at detection, one of the key things is trying to discriminate, is it a friend or a foe, as Ms. Elman said. And without remote identification and knowing something about that UAS, it's very hard for them to do that. So they're treating all of them equally at this point. One of the key reasons why Title 18 relief is critical for departments like DHS is to be able to do more testing of these various technologies in civil environments where there are interferences and impacts that are very different than they are in a conflict zone. And that's hopefully something that they'll be able to achieve authority to do. And then we've all been sharing data. DOD has shared data with the Interagency Department of Energy as they're doing testing to be able to ensure, again, that we understand the impacts as we take this very deliberate, judicious approach to bringing it into the national airspace system.
AKA, we're testing shit and we want military equipment because all the stuff the private sector is creating doesn't work. She could have just said that.
Just to your point about the distance from the airport, could you just restate that again? I might have.
Yes, sir.
How far did you say?
So about 75% of the UAS sightings that are reported to the FAA are occurring 3 nautical miles or more from the airport. So detection at the airport using this type of rather expensive and at this point underperforming technology in the airport environment is not something the FAA supports. We think that remote identification that's going to enable us to identify and locate the operator, to engage them for education or when necessary enforcement, is going to remove a lot of those activities from the airspace, bring them into compliance, and thus reduce the concerns of our airport authority partners.
That is the most sensible thing I've heard the entire time.
Drones, particularly recreational drones, be required to have geofenced, GPS technology built in to keep them out of prohibited areas?
Certainly, geofencing is an option. It can be a challenging option depending on
temporary closures of airspace.
Right, as well as we're also seeing UAS being used actually on the airport to do inspection of runways, to do inspection of aircraft. So there are some challenges with sort of just a blanket dependence on geofencing.
Okay. Anybody else want to follow up on that?
I will, Ranking Member DeFazio.
A geofence is not going to stop me.
Point, that is a technology among several that are built into a vast majority of consumer drones today. One solution doesn't solve all problems, of course, but that, along with altitude limitations, remote or return to home in the event of low battery, and various other hardware and software technologies are helping to support safer operations of the drones themselves in the consumer space.
Thank you for the question, Ranking Member. On behalf of the commercial drone community, we are very much in support of the spirit of the counter-drone legislation, but we do urge, as well, just like David described in the manned aviation context, of course, there is the risk of interference with authorized commercial drones. And so, we believe that the legislation should authorize surgical, selective, safe technologies that narrowly targets the individual drone that's a threat in the air. Obviously, there could be collateral damage. There's all different types of counter-UAS technology out there. There could be collateral damage that's even worse than the initial risk itself. So we are very much in support of this legislation, but we believe that there needs to be very much attention to that and how it might interfere with authorized operations.
Yes, sir. Just had one thing to add. Certainly, and Sorry. One thing to add, Ms. Stubblefield pointed out perfectly that what we found as we've implemented within DoD is that it's the combination of technologies is producing most effective. There's not one solution that is most effective. But just to hammer a point home, specifically when we're talking about RF and the concerns that brings, when we're talking about endorsement for remote ID and the importance to it, just to understand that right now from a DoD installation perspective and what we need to do from a defense and security side of the house is that we need to understand who's out there, because right now, without remote ID in place, we see a drone pop up. We have evidence in facilities of sensitive nature where there's 9 hobbyist organizations, AMA certified, et cetera, operating in that area. And we have drones pop up that we don't know who they are.
What the fuck are they talking
about? What we're doing is creating an environment where those people that are responsible for potential use of RF in the airspace are forced with the decision to use it to be able to understand what's out there. And remote ID will reduce that.
They're talking about you right now, Wu-Tang.
And therefore reduce the risk that we put in place because we're using RF. If we can eliminate the need to use an RF capability, we're far better off from an overall safety standpoint. And so it's a combination of safety and security that we really need to address, and that remote ID is a very important part of that.
Thanks, Chairman. Thanks for being here. This is interesting. One concern I have is we don't pass legislation or regulation that puts more burden on it and stifles the industry and stifles, what we're trying not to do. I'm trying to understand the technology a little bit because I want to make sure that utilities checking the utility. I'll give you a couple examples. Utilities checking their utility lines, farmers checking their fields, realtors taking pictures of, for the auction and that. When you talk, Mr. Johnson, you talk about less capable.
Yeah, they're saying we're flying on their frequencies,
ID.
basically.
Drones that would do those basic functions I just mentioned, are they limited in what they could do for this other?
This is where it gets interesting. The questions come out.
Terrible things we don't want to think about. Can you explain a bit, or would remote ID have to be in all of them, or how's this technology interface?
What the fuck is this question?
Happy to elaborate on the point I made earlier about that.
It's like, I don't know what your question is. I'm just going to restate what I said earlier.
Distinguishing based on capabilities. And if there's a drone that fits in the palm of my hand that can only fly a few feet away and back, probably don't need remote ID for something like that. But the thinking in the remote ID arc on this point was that the drones that have the capability to fly autonomously, point to point, that can fly beyond 400 feet and have some sort of sensor built into them are in fact the ones of great concern. I think most, if not all, parties recognize that remote ID solutions should apply in those cases. So when I say distinguishing based on capabilities, I think at some level we have to say, well, these really aren't appropriate for remote ID, but all these really are.
Go ahead.
I would just mention on the remote ID ARC report, there was not consensus around the use of a capabilities-based approach. There was disagreement over which drone should on the ARC. Correct. Yeah, there was not consensus on that point. From the commercial drone industry or the Commercial Drone Alliance perspective, we had proposed a weight-based approach, which is familiar because it's the same approach as the current registration threshold, 250 grams and above. And
it says that last part.
250 grams and above is what we had proposed, although that could vary. But the idea is just the heavier the vehicle, you could have a very heavy vehicle that isn't capable of flying very far.
So they're saying that, hey, if you're small and tiny, you're not a threat.
Highways in the sky, we're all in the same drone ecosystem flying together. So, rather than focusing on intent or capabilities, our proposal had been focus on weight and give the FAA the discretion to properly regulate all UAS.
But I just raised another thought with a drone vehicle that can't go high could have the capability to do radio frequency jamming or screwing with it, I guess. I'm not to say it.
Oh my God, this guy does not know what he's saying.
Concerned still or not? Or
if it's going to be high in the air, is that what you're saying?
Well, I don't know. I want to make sure that we're not going to put an undue burden on
undue burden. He wants to make sure that we should ban these machines because they could be sending out video signals to people.
Versus somebody wants to do harm. That has the technology. I'm trying to understand the technology. you know, if we have a drone that's capable of doing the things I mentioned, but is it still capable of doing these other things? Or you know, we have certain, I want to show the regulatory environment fits the right, to do the right protection. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir. I certainly share that there's a balance we need to address. But I think what we need to make sure we understand in that discussion is that when we leave a pathway for a malicious user that could, you know, impose danger to us from a security and defense perspective, that's what we're trying to safeguard against. Right now, we have an exposed vulnerability because we don't have the ability to ID all from a remote perspective. So we're inducing an increased risk in the airspace because we're using counter UAS technology to be able to do that for us. Whereas remote ID is going to provide the right balance of safety and security, and that's why we need to approach remote ID.
I honestly think a remote ID system could work.
Remote ID and all the UAVs or not?
Well, there are always costs associated with technologies at some level.
So a remote ID system, I'm just going to pop back here for a second to explain how that can work. A drone is outputting a signal, and just like remotely identifying a cell phone, it's really easy to triangulate the signal where it's coming from. All you need is 3 points of contact, 3 towers picking up the same signal to triangulate where that signal is coming from. So a remote ID system could work across the board for a myriad of drones without having to be on the actual machine itself. So sorry for that. I just want to move on to explain it because these people are not.
The point I was trying to make was that some drones clearly aren't of great concern, but many are. And the remote ID ARC, we heard in the remote ID ARC, we heard from law enforcement that their greatest concern were drones with these capabilities.
Yeah.
So notwithstanding the fact that there wasn't total agreement on that point, there was a recognition that some distinction is appropriate, whether it's done one way or another.
Mr. Gibbs, but I very much appreciate your point because we're obviously trying to enable expanded commercial operations to do utility inspection or pipeline inspection or power line inspection, disaster response over people. And the commercial drone industry has, because these drone security issues, including remote ID, as well as counter UAS authorities, have not yet been dealt with, the commercial drone industry has been hindered. We don't have the broad expanded operations to fly beyond visual line of sight or over people or at night. The operations over people rule was about to be proposed about 1.5 years ago, and then during the interagency process, it was held up because of these drone security concerns. So I'm very encouraged that we're all here talking about these issues, since we clearly need to focus on these issues so that we can enable this amazing new marketplace to truly open. Right now, a lot of folks are having to, a lot of companies are having to go fly overseas and do their research and development and testing in other countries.
It's very right.
We don't have the regulatory framework here in the U.S.
It's very true. She said some stuff that wasn't complete bullshit.
Industry, along with our regulators, has a very strong history about determining, based upon operational use and risk, as to what measures should be put in place. I mean, we have distinctions between Part 23 and Part 25, operational 121, 135. So the key thing is starting the dialogue as soon as possible, coming to agreement that it's the appropriate and right thing to do, and then moving out and presenting everybody with the solution.
Identification system. Identification and education. Identification and education. It's so easy.
Mr. Mucklow,
they don't need
DOD
to make it
was granted
complicated.
authority in 2016 for certain facilities. You rolled it out, though, for only 2 facilities to date. Is that right?
NDA in 2017 was the first authority, and at this point we have 2 facilities operational using counter UAS capability. That's correct, sir.
Is that, would you characterize that as a slow rollout, or are you?
I characterize it as a deliberate and necessarily deliberate rollout.
Yeah.
That we've done it in a deliberate fashion, working closely with our partners to make sure we introduce this capability safely.
Yeah. Without going into details of which facilities, are you using different counter UAS at each of the facilities? Is there a mix of?
So yes, sir. So it's a process where the first 2, it's the same capability, but at the same time in several other installations, we're just about to start testing of additional capabilities. And we continue to look at emerging technology that can be used to counter this threat. So our capabilities will also emerge as we continue to evaluate the threat. But what we're moving to is that combination of capabilities at our installations, because no one capability is going to do the job for us.
So, Ms. Stubblefield, how do you? And I don't know if you.
I like to keep going back to Stubblefield. She knows what she's talking about a little bit.
You've got a couple of airports, I know at least one, Honolulu and Hickam, where the airport and the Air Force Base are practically one and the same, right next door to each other.
Those are probably the two bases where they have anti-UAS technologies.
A circumstance where, like a SeaTac, which isn't really, well, it's close to DOJ facilities and DHS facilities, which is another concern of mine. But it's not necessarily close to.
And we don't have anybody representing the FPV community or drone community at this conference. The closest thing we have is the guy with the red tie.
And I think it's important to talk about, as Mr. Mucklow said, this deliberative judicious process. There are procedures and guidance that are being managed at multiple levels within DoD. There's some guidance that is DoD-wide. There is some guidance and instruction that is coming at each service is providing. And then there are things that are site-specific. And so it's in that site-specific space where we really start to look at what is the particular technology, what is the air traffic environment, as you point out, being co-located or being further distant from an airport. All of those things are part of the discussion about what are the appropriate concepts of operations and the tactics, techniques, and procedures for utilizing those. So in a particular environment where perhaps there's not a lot of air traffic around it, particular types of technologies with different power settings or omnidirectional versus directional may be appropriate because the impacts are not going to be significant on air traffic. However, in a situation where you're very close to a heavy, densely populated traffic environment, those technologies or at different settings may not be appropriate. So it is very much a site-specific analysis that we're doing in a risk-based approach with DoD and other partners to make sure that we're finding that balance such that they can meet their protective mission needs, but the impacts are manageable without degrading safety.
Would you take that same kind of approach if DOJ and DHS had authorities?
Absolutely. And in fact, really, we've been breaking ground with DoD. We have a roadmap we've put together, checklist we've put together that we're utilizing also with the Department of Energy, and similarly we'll be sharing with DHS and DOJ should they receive authority. Because from the FAA's perspective, we have to deal with everyone who's bringing the technology into the airspace. So consistency and a consistent rigor of process and procedure is incredibly important to us to being able to manage the workload associated with the proliferation of these technologies in the system.
So they're basically saying drones are getting big and we don't have enough money and funding and time to actually manage it. So I think they're really going to be pushing for a new agency that does nothing but drones.
Sure.
We have not, when the administration introduced the proposal to try to get authority for the Departments of Homeland Security and Justice earlier this year, we did do outreach with a variety of what we call traditional airspace stakeholders, which did include general aviation, business aviation, obviously our commercial air carrier partners, to walk them through and reassure them that the FAA has a strong coordination.
I'd be happy to represent us at a conference.
Where we are with DoD and DOE, but in what is envisioned.
I think they'd have a hard time debating me because I'm a really good debater.
Assured that the
and I know what I'm talking about.
Our focus is on mitigating impacts to both manned aviation and legitimate unmanned users as well.
Yeah, I'll just.
We've got the Space Force. We're going to have a drone force.
DOJ and
it's going to happen.
If we have to do it, it should be very deliberate. There are more of those facilities than say DoD facilities, it would seem, and so you're just going to start potentially carving up that lower altitude in the airspace that you regulate, and we just need to be real careful about that.
Yes, sir. We definitely agree that it needs to be a deliberative approach. And again, in the proposals that have been put forward for their authority, they've been tailored missions and they have maintained that strong coordination position for the FAA and taking a risk-based approach to how and under what circumstances and which technologies are utilized.
Yeah, I haven't been here that long, but tailored missions become untailored missions fairly soon around here.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you. Regarding remote IDs, it seems to me they're a lot like transponders in aircraft. Is that accurate or not? Certainly, transponders give remote ID and data.
Pretty much permanent no-fly zones.
Yeah, so it's going to. I guess I would start by saying, sir, that we don't know what the prescriptive. We wouldn't make anything prescriptive as to how it operates, whether it's done via Wi-Fi or whether it's an actual transponder upon the aircraft. I would recommend that you allow industry to figure out what's the cheapest, most economical way to give law enforcement the required data.
Okay, shut the front door. First and foremost, do not put the burden on the drone manufacturers to create a system to detect the drones. Create a system that detects drones. You can make a system that will find the erratic signals in the air. Like, it's not that hard. It's not that hard. It's really, really not that hard. And that's what's really kind of pissing me off, is that if you have a location that you need to protect, you can create a system that detects the signals coming off of these machines, pinpoints where the drone is and where the operator is, regardless if they're using Crossfire 2.4 FR Sky, DJI Wi-Fi, or whatever have you. The fact that they don't understand that, and the fact they don't comprehend that that system could work, and that's how it should be, is so frustrating. So frustrating. I mean, yeah, if it's a Wi-Fi system, you could see the drone moving and the operator is standing in one spot. And you could pick up what signal the drone's transmitting on, like the actual frequency, and pick up on the frequency being given off by the transmitter to actually pinpoint if it's a transmitter for a drone or if it's a transmitter for Wi-Fi. So there's ways for them to detect these machines without having to spend $1 billion. Like, this system would not cost a lot of money to create and implement. And the fact that they're having this discussion right now about all these other issues is making me very, very, very upset. So I'm sorry for pausing the video. I just had to rant.
Well, than just the remote ID of the aircraft itself. I envision a world where there's going to be potentially thousands of drones flying through.
In a world with thousands of drones, we need a system that works with everyone.
People. So as critical as knowing who it is, being able to identify which one you're really concerned about, so that's going to require information like, you know, speed, heading, distance.
Which the system I just said would be able to do.
In order to make it what they would use, usable information as opposed to just information.
Anyone have anything to add to that? Yes, sir.
Just about the importance of industry standards in this area. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, one of our recent initiatives is to develop an industry standard for remote identification. This is a fundamental. In fact, even before that, we developed an industry consensus standard for serial numbers as kind of a building block. So the role of standards is recognized certainly by FAA. The technology is there, but the standards need to be there too, need to be referenced ultimately as well. So that's another area where we're making a contribution.
And I'm happy to have industry really develop its own standard and present. I think that makes a lot of sense. As you're thinking through that, how are you going to account for the fact that for decades, and rightfully so, there have been aircraft flying in what is now known as Class G airspace that aren't required to have transponders, that do carry some of this information that you're talking about. And it's never been a problem.
Hey, some common sense. Common sense!
It's particularly airspace that is not
I love it.
airports.
I love it.
Not otherwise heavily traveled.
I love it.
It is the most voluminous class.
This guy right here, this dude, he knows what he's talking about.
It certainly goes to most areas of this country up to 700 feet.
Check him out.
And I don't think anyone would stand for having required planes that fly in those areas and just in those areas.
It's like we don't require planes to have transponders in those areas.
Or anything else. So how are you going to safeguard the encroachment from your standards into aircrafts and whether or not they have to have transponders or a remote ID?
If I may, sir, I think when we look at remote ID from the FAA's perspective. And I want to be quite clear that remote ID is not just about security. It's also about safety. As we look to expand operations, we have to have the ability.
Isn't that what this is all about? Safety
UAS
at the end of the day?
Other UAS are, and that's a key fundamental piece. But also, when we talk about our security partner's stake in this, it's knowing where the operator is.
Again, the system I just brought up would be able to tell you where the operator is, and we don't have to add anything to the drones, and it would work with hobbyist drones as well as commercial grade drones. Seriously, why the hell am I not out there being able to tell these people what's up? It's really, really, really frustrating that they're going through this rigmarole when the solution is so obvious.
Just to cut to the chase, so see and avoid is a key component here, and you can see and avoid with aircraft in Class G. You can't see and avoid necessarily with the drones. With the drones. Go off line of sight.
Correct, and I would argue that we have remote identification on every manned aircraft because we have tail numbers. In a tail number, I can tell.
Dude, what the hell? That's it? We have remote identification on every aircraft because we have tail numbers. Oh, that is bullshit. When there's aircraft, and this happens all the time in Santa Cruz, when there's an aircraft, they break the law. They will fly below 400 feet. And I'll tell you right now, if you try to read a tail number off a Cessna at 300 feet, it is near impossible without optical accessories. So, there's full-scale pilots breaking the law all the time where I live, and there's nothing tracking them.
Something about that aircraft, and right now, so I can make some limited threat discrimination.
Would tail numbers be good for you guys?
It's a little hard to see.
For the drones?
Well, we have registration.
Yeah, we already have
registration. We have registration.
Right.
Can't see that.
Yeah, I think from an aircraft, another aircraft in the air. Like last year we had an incident
that was
22 was in close proximity to the UAS. I don't think that's going to help in that category. Right. But certainly from an installation protection perspective, anything that can identify something rapidly is what we're after. And so in that case,
again, system I just said would be able to identify it rapidly.
Again, sir, I don't know what the solution is.
And the thing is the system I'm talking about is so rudimentary that I could probably build it myself. All it is receivers set up on basically a diversity receiver on different channels, picking it up with 3 stations, all talking to each other, coordinating the ping time of the signal, and then overlaying that on a map where the ping time is going to represent location data. It's pretty stupid simple, and systems like this have existed before, and there's nothing new to it. It's just they're not thinking about it.
And but in my mind, I imagine a concept where if I had a helicopter flying over a installation, I would have means of communicating with that pilot to tell him he's in the wrong place. So, however that means is attained, whether it's through a remote ID that gives me a pilot's remote operator's number that I can call and tell him he's in the wrong place, before I even have to escalate. We don't shoot helicopters out of the sky, I hope. But the same thing I think would be the goal with remote ID.
Well, that's sensible. That's very sensible.
I just want to add quickly that the federal government has held back on expanded operations flights beyond visual line of sight, partly because there are these unidentified. And it's not anything about modelers. There's nothing about modelers that have changed. They still fly in a way that is safe. The airspace around them has changed, and so
what the hell?
The technology.
That's amazing. She just admitted that what we do is safe. That's awesome. Now they're going to forget about what she said and go right back to how they can take our drones out of the air.
Proliferates, and the commercial drone industry is now emerging. The rules of there just need to be some very basic rules of the road that are low cost.
So that's interesting because I wasn't talking about model.
So now the guy's like, I'm not talking about model aircraft, but she's just like, but we need to have rules for model aircraft. After she just got done saying there's been no issues with model aircraft. So the double talk from her is just under my skin.
As I was mentioning general aviation mostly.
Okay.
She is with the FAA. She is one of the hazardous materials safety people.
But that was my next set of questions. A nice segue, and very quickly, so out of respect for my colleagues. My good friend, Mr. DeFazio, mentioned 336, and he referenced modelers. and said, do any of you think that 336 doesn't need to be changed? And again, he referenced modelers. It left me with the impression that you all thought something was wrong with what modelers were doing. So I want to go into more detail here. What have
they're going to talk
done
about
or
us
not
now
done that make them that we need to change 336 to affect modelers? FAA?
Yes, sir. Thank you for digging more deeply into that question. As you rightly point out, the around 200,000 or so modelers that exist out there today have been flying safely. They are aviation enthusiasts. The challenge, as Ms. Elman...
Artists, they're scientists, most of the astronauts that have flown on the space shuttle.
I just gotta say, this dude who's talking and who's had a couple really good questions, he is absolutely amazing. So he's said some really good stuff. I'm glad this is not an echo chamber and that people are actually saying some very good points. So I have to say thank you for bringing this information up. And I like the fact we are modelers. Yes, there's 200,000 of us that have been doing it safely.
On other missions have been modelers themselves.
Absolutely, sir. And many people who can no longer do manned flight choose to do modeling as a way, again, to keep that love of aviation, which we absolutely prize along with them. However, the environment in which they're operating has changed.
Did you hear that? I almost spit soda out of my mouth and nose. They've been doing it safely, but the environment that they're doing it in has changed. The game has changed. The game has changed. It's different now.
And the challenge with Section 336 is it lends ambiguity and nuance that has led to noncompliance. That is to say, we have probably 500,000 to 700,000 additional UAS that are registered as hobbyists or recreationalists.
So what are we going to do to protect the people who haven't done anything wrong as the airspace gets more complicated?
I love this dude.
If 336 were repealed or significantly changed, the FAA has not taken a heavy-handed approach with modelers in the past.
So what are your comments?
She's talking about taking a heavy-handed approach in the future. What the hell?
GTA first.
Excuse me. Very quickly, we can go to round two.
Okay.
But we got a lot of members who want to ask questions.
Damn, he just got shut down. What the hell?
I was done with my question.
Okay.
He's like, I wasn't done with my question.
Our organization and others in the unmanned and manned aviation space came together and worked on language that is reflected in the Sanford Davis Amendment that would support that culture of compliance among the hundreds of thousands of operators that were just referenced. We think that's the right approach. Wholesale repeal of 336 is not. We think we have a solution in the form of that language.
I'm curious what that language is and the solution within that.
Okay, thank you. Donald, you're up.
Mr.
Wait, what's going on today? What am I doing?
After 9/11,
what are we doing today?
Department of Homeland Security was founded.
But what's going on?
In part to ensure greater operational harmony
Am I here
among the
today?
country's myriad of intelligence and national security agencies.
Blah.
But drones were not really on anyone's radar.
Drones were on radar.
16 years ago.
16 years ago, no drones.
This space is regulated by disparate agencies in different departments. Please tell us about the operational successes and hurdles you face regulating drones in cooperation with each other and other agencies.
Thank you, sir. As we've talked about, the main challenge right now that we and our security partners see is really about identifying friendly, compliant drones from non-compliant drones, those who are just clueless and careless versus those who have hostile intent. And because we don't have remote identification that's universally applicable, because not all UAS are held to a basic set of safety standards and operational requirements, such as complying with airspace restrictions or authorization and control of airspace.
Hey, if you're a 107 pilot, you have to do that. So as a 107 pilot for commercial gigs, I have to obey those rules.
That is a challenge not only from the safety perspective, but from the security perspective. And when we look at the security framework we put in place after 9/11, which is very robust, working with both DoD and DHS, it is predicated on knowing who's in the airspace and having defined roles and responsibilities and capabilities to respond appropriately when those hazards are identified. The FAA's role is to identify a hazard in the airspace, move aircraft away from it, and then work with our partners to address that risk. That's the very same framework we're looking to establish with unmanned aircraft. Remote identification and ensuring there are some basic requirements that apply to every UAS are key foundational pieces to building a robust security framework that can complement and indeed support the further integration of UAS.
Again, all we need is a system that can pinpoint where the drone is and where the operator is. So law enforcement can do their job and find out what's going on. And possibly even intercept the video signals. So if you're flying, law enforcement can see what the drone is doing. I think something like that is needed. And yeah, it's stupid because that kind of system would actually work with environments that they need to protect, and then non-restricted environments would work much like they do now, which would be open airspace. So you could, restrict the issues where they are issues and keep it open where it's not an issue. And it's really asinine that they're making this such a big problem when, into my eyes, it's such an easy fix.
Yes, Congressman Payne, thank you for that question. And the relationship with DOD and DHS is superb. We work together on a number of issues. Certainly the UAS problem, the ability to counter it, is something we work closely together with. In fact, we are presently doing a study within the National Capital Region to look at information sharing improvement between installations from the Department of Defense and those facilities which our DHS and law enforcement partners are responsible to protect. So improved information sharing is certainly a solution that helps.
So improved information sharing equals brand new agency that is developed out to handle drones.
In this ability to
just saying, that's what I hear.
So we work in that way, and in fact, in the National Capital Region, we have the National Capital Region Coordination Center to be able to feed all information from any of our partners as to what we are seeing and observing and detecting with respect to UAS. And we use that information and share it amongst one another to make sure that we provide that right security. And certainly an FAA is a key aspect of that. So it goes back to not just the security aspect of what we're trying to achieve, but also safety. That if we know something is certainly not a malicious user, we all want to know that, and we want to know that as rapidly as we can. So we're not putting something like RF transmissions into the airspace unnecessarily.
And and a lot of my work at Homeland has been around interoperability, so it's good to hear that you're working well together. The other question: how many instances of hostiles do you find? Is
this guy on like cough syrup?
Proliferation of incidents that you find security risk?
I can give you the Department of Defense numbers. From last year, there was over 75.
Like, I could be stoned out of my mind and still not slur my words as much as that guy.
Documented incursions into prohibited airspace that we worked with the FAA to ensure there was prohibited airspace, and we still had incursions into that airspace. And those are the ones that are documented. Certainly in larger facilities, we probably had more incursions than that were undocumented. But that's just data from last year.
Okay, thank you.
And if I may, Congressman, what's important to note is we don't know how many of those were actually hostile because we don't have the ability to identify the locator. Exactly, sir. So they could be folks that just strayed into the wrong place. But that's, again, part of the challenge with not having that ability to locate the operator.
So hostile should be, did the drone do something that was hostile, or was it just looking around? Last time I checked, taking photos is not a hostile activity. So if taking photos all of a sudden makes you a hostile, then what the heck? Like, I just can't even.
And find out what exactly they were doing there.
I see. Okay, I'll yield back, sir.
Jason.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the panel for taking the time to inform us on some of these things. Let me see if I can't just shift gears a little bit away from national airspace and national security assets, even away from general aviation, and get into more privacy and property rights. Talking about schools and somebody's backyard and businesses and things like that, and how we're going to find the sweet spot on those sorts of balancing acts between this wonderful technology and now counter technology and privacy and property rights. As some of you know, I offered an amendment to the FAA bill to support the FAA.
Yeah, no, they have to track pilots and find out what we're all doing.
Because I thought the solution to those problems were a mix of federal and local law. But when it comes to counter drone technology, I also believe we need to tread kind of carefully there too, in determining how we use that so we're not interfering with the technology. So what are the plans, or where are we with regard to something below 400 feet and somebody's use of counter UAS technology, and where you think we should be going here? Because I do think that there's some unanimity here on obviously national airspace, commercial flights, national security assets, and something, in order to protect that. But the elephant in the living room still is those folks on the ground are worried about A, someone misusing drone technology, but B, somebody misusing counter drone technology. So I just want to open that up to the panel and see if we can't drill down a little bit there and see what your thoughts are. Anyone, it doesn't matter.
Representative Lewis, I'll start, if I may, sir. First, we agree with you that the integrated pilot program is really going to be critical in figuring out what that mix looks like between local, state, and federal authorities and responsibilities in this space. So we're very excited and putting a lot of resource and energy into ensuring we can get
so many what ifs. So many what ifs.
To your point around, individuals' concerns with the use of UAS, certainly, again, I'll go back to remote identification. Just as now, if you're a homeowner and you see a prowler or someone has, is trying to get into your home, you call law enforcement.
Right.
That's very much the same protocol we would expect when someone sees a UAS and is concerned that it presents either a privacy or a potential safety or security concern. But right now, law enforcement shows up. They might be able to see the UAS, but they don't know where the operator is and they don't know who it belongs to. Therefore, the ability to take action is limited. Which brings us to the counter UAS piece. Right now, because the vast majority of the technologies and really any mitigation technology runs afoul of current federal laws, only a few federal agencies have that authority. No state, local, or private entities have that authority. And again, because of the nature of the technology that is currently out there for counter UAS, it is not something that's appropriate to sort of just turn loose for anyone to use because of the significant potential consequences for not only aviation spectrum impacts and avionics, but also other uses of the spectrum as well. Emergency response communications, law enforcement communications, things of that nature can also be interrupted by these types of technologies.
Let me get the rest of you.
Yeah, so that was semi-sensible. She's like, okay, government should only have the ability to use this technology against anti-UAS because it's most likely going to screw with potentially regular operating of other frequencies. So this technology shouldn't be in the hands of the everyday public. Right now, that's currently the way it is. To jam signals, you need to have basically a federal license to do that, which is very hard to get, and you have to be a federal agent to do that. So right now, the way the laws are written, we don't have to change a single thing to create an identification system for drones. We don't have to have a single thing change to identify the operators. And we don't have to have a single thing change to keep that technology out of the hands of people that shouldn't have it. So nothing really needs to change. The only thing that needs to happen is a company to finally step up and to create a reliable system that can detect drones and the users and where they are. That's all. And I already know that system exists because Apple's been using it at their campus. So the technology already exists. They just have to implement it at locations they think are at risk. It's that simple. They're making this way more complicated than it has to be, talking about repealing laws, adding new laws, changing things, having new systems in place that are installed on the drones, which makes no sense. All of that can be simply just put to the side if they were just smart about what they call a radar. All we need is a drone radar. And it could be very easily implemented. And I just, anyways.
You to respond, but I guess the question I've got is which law enforcement? I mean, we're all looking for a way to allow law enforcement to do their due diligence to protect privacy and property, but which branch of law enforcement? And that's the battle, not the battle, but that's sort of the sweet spot
that is
we're trying
one of
to
the
find.
issues, yeah.
And with regard to the counter
UAS
technology, we've got to find that sweet spot because otherwise, I'm afraid the counter drone technology is going to look like a shotgun, and we don't want that. So that's my point. Go ahead.
Come at me, bro. I'll take your shotgun on.
And it's a really great point on privacy issues. And I just wanted to make the point that as we're considering this legislation, privacy and protecting proprietary data and business-sensitive data and trade secrets for the commercial drone community is very important. I'm holding up my iPhone because for many, this is actually the control station of the drone. And so if I am flying my drone using my iPhone and my drone is hacked into, then my iPhone essentially is hacked into. And there's obviously loads of data on this phone that is not related at all to that flight. So this is something that we should absolutely be paying attention to, and I thank you for the question.
Excuse me 1 minute. It was an interesting question. Which law enforcement? Who do you call?
Sir, so what we envision with remote identification, and we are currently working on that rulemaking, would be down to local law enforcement to be able to get information about that UAS.
That's true. That's something that should happen.
And location. That's what we envision at this point.
That's what I envision.
Chairman. This would be the 21st century equivalent of trespassing. And the trespassing is a standard common law nuisance, which local law enforcement and the police power handle.
Absolutely.
Whether it's drone or counter drone.
Well, certainly from the perspective of being able to respond to, identify, and engage with the potential perpetrator. Now, the manner beyond that in terms of engaging the aircraft itself, because of the technologies that are available, to include perhaps a shotgun, bullets go up, they also come down somewhere. And just as police officers don't readily discharge their service weapons, we wouldn't expect the same as well in that regard.
Okay, I want to yield back, but just let me say this is something we've got to figure out, or the courts will. I can guarantee you that, but I appreciate your testimony today, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Eleanor, you're next.
Essentially, both the technology and the regulatory and legal environment are growing at the same time. For example, there have been reports
were they laughing?
At least 100 sightings of USA a month. Whether they are have the identification requirements or not, they're there. I am not sure. What we do as we develop, and Congress, of course, is late here. And once there's a report, and apparently these reports are coming from pilots, they're coming from observers of various kinds, who do they report to, and what happens as a result?
She's like, what does it work, and how does it work?
To at least the reports that come to the FAA. You're correct that the FAA does receive approximately 100 reports per month. They come primarily from pilots, but we also do get them from the public, we get them from law enforcement, from other agents.
So remember, the FAA's report on unidentified flying objects is down. The FAA's report on drones is up, almost by the same amount that has decreased in the UFO sightings. So keep that in mind.
There are also local or federal law enforcement that also collects numbers and takes incident reports as well. Right now, because we don't have remote identification, follow-up on those incidents is very difficult.
It's a pretty lawless environment at this time.
I'm sorry, say again, ma'am?
A pretty lawless environment at this time. There's no.
We're in the wild, wild west of drones. It's a lawless environment, and there's evil quad pilots diving buildings and ruining the hobby by diving planes.
Nobody to take action. There are reports.
There's nobody to take action.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
But there's no action to be taken because Congress hasn't authorized any, and the FAA has no regulatory.
But we must have rules for these drones, these evil drones.
About the development of some interim response. Perhaps the Department of Defense witnesses would be even more concerned that while we are getting hold of the identification,
while we're doing all these things, we must have rules and laws that cannot be implemented.
Interim mechanism.
We must have a mechanism.
We're not left with a lawless environment as it.
Mechanism or lawlessness. We must have mechanism or lawlessness.
Yes, sir.
Representative Norton, thank you for that question. Certainly, I want to add a couple of things. First, within the Department of Defense, Secretary Shanahan directed our force protection plans, those plans that are in place to protect our installations that are incorporating counter-UAS capability as we implement it. There is direction to them to incorporate working with the local law enforcement and partners on all their planning and reporting actions, because we need to get the information from users on the ground.
Are you at least keeping between the FAA and the Department of Defense records of these reports?
Absolutely.
So that's how we know there are 100, approximately 100 per month.
Jesus fudge! She just like, so there's records of these reports? And the guy's like, yeah, we got reports. That's how we have a record of them. Oh my God.
Certainly, and what we want to do is go after the users to make sure it's not malicious use, and sometimes it may be accidental use. And one such example was during Fleet Week, where we have ships within the Department of Defense go up to New York City. They were operating up there. There was a drone in the vicinity. It was reported by the people, the Navy personnel on the ship, to local law enforcement, and the New York City Police Department actually went and found the user on the ground and
goddamn Casey Neistat
determined that it was not malicious, it was just accidental, and they
Casey Neistat
took whatever action they deemed necessary. But from a
just let him go.
Department of Defense perspective, we wanted to make sure it was reported to law enforcement and that they did take whatever action they could to make sure it was no malicious activity.
There was some identification, some ID with respect to those drones, and of course, therefore you knew where to go to at least to find out.
In most cases, not. In fact,
so there wasn't even on those.
We had one specific case where we could actually go and found the actual operator, but in most cases, we are not able to locate the operator, though, despite law enforcement seeking to. It's a challenge.
Mr. Silver, you had a.
It's a challenge. You know what? When someone was flying a Mavic over my house recently, I walked outside and I found the operator. It doesn't have to be always a challenge.
Comment on that.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am. I think that the maintenance of the safety record of our current national airspace is preeminent and must be achieved.
I'm amazed that we're able to keep it safe, given how little we're able to do and how little we know about this environment, and with no regulatory mechanism in the interim to deal with it.
Yeah, we want to.
I can't believe how safe things are when we don't have laws to implement things. What the shit? You want to add more laws when things have already been safe as they are. The double think that's involved in her head right now must be incredibly strong.
Continue to enable the growth while at the same time maintaining that safety record. Now, we have partnered with the FAA, both manufacturers, both from the traditional manufacturers as well as with the The new entrants are, there is a UAS safety team, which was formed that is built upon the model of the civil aviation safety team, where manufacturers are working with the regulatory agencies to come up with solutions that don't require regulation to ensure that events like these don't occur.
Regulate birds.
Which is got to be a paramount goal of whatever.
See, otherwise you get what you have in, this is my district, the nation's capital. You have.
Wow, she represents the nation's capital. This is depressing.
Have a total ban on U.S. You can't do anything here. And actually, despite that there was one that landed on the grounds of the Capitol, shows you what lawlessness is really all about. Are there other areas? By the way,
seriously, guys, we need to regulate birds. Birds have hit more planes every year than any other object in existence. And a bird was responsible for having a plane land in the river over in somewhere. Sully Sullivan, or whatever his name is. He landed a plane because of a bird. Birds are more dangerous than drones. We must regulate birds.
Around defense and security.
Birds have weapons, says Man High.
As there are around the certain bans in the nation's capital. Are there places in the United States like that where there are total bans? Have they been configured so we know where they are around the United States?
Yes, ma'am. So the FAA has used its 14 CFR 99.7 authority for sensitive security instructions to put up temporary flight restrictions, UAS specific flight restrictions at facilities, federal facilities across the country. Right now, the FAA only has the authority to take those requests from federal defense, intelligence, or security agencies, and we have in fact done that. We have over 300 facilities from DOD, the Department of Interior, the Department of Justice, the U.S. Coast Guard, as well, where we have put up those restrictions because of the sensitive nature of those facilities. And we have a public website where that information is available. So a number of third-party vendors download that information. The FAA also has a Before You Fly app that enables users to go in and basically, based on where they're physically located or where they plan to operate, they can determine where there are these prohibited areas in which they should not be operating. So we are taking those steps to try to educate.
And those bans have where you can't operate at all, but they've been effective.
Yes,
are those bans effective?
This is where we get to that place because the locations that Mr. Mucklow talked about are also restricted areas where UAS shouldn't be flying. The challenge is getting to the operators and educating them and ensuring they understand that. And this is again where unfortunately Section 336 has presented that challenge.
I was gonna say we have a
large number of recreational users that don't understand that they are part of the national airspace system, don't know that there are rules and requirements, and therefore are operating in places that they shouldn't be. And because again, we don't have the authority to assert a basic set of requirements across the totality of everyone operating in the airspace, that is our challenge. And both the safety, the efficiency, and the security of the national airspace system depends on everybody cooperating and everybody participating. And right now, we don't have that option.
Understanding what the rules are. Mr. Johnson, you had a response.
Thank you. Yes, for sure, an easier path to compliance is going to help support safer and lawful drone operations. So that's really important. And the approach there that we're supportive of, as I mentioned earlier, in legislation that's pending is essentially a Part 107 light. Let's make it easier for.
So now they're talking about implementing a new regulation that basically be a Part 107 light, which doesn't make sense because that wouldn't stop the criminals and all the other issues that they're talking about. It would just create more regulations, more hassle for people that are already following the rules to continue to do so.
Those hundreds of thousands of operators to comply with requirements that are appropriate for consumer recreational hobbyist users.
Ew.
The other point I'd like to make
and this guy is part of, I believe, the Commercial Coalition. So he is supposed to be on our side.
Even if we had remote ID today, and it was everywhere, education is still going to be really important to get to those operators that were mentioned before, the clueless, the careless. So we're really going to have to continue that as kind of an evergreen effort going forward.
Thank you very much.
Just a quick question, Angela, are nuclear plants on that ban list?
So nuclear facilities are privately held or state held, and therefore the FAA's current authority under 99.7 does not extend to them unless they were to be sponsored by a federal entity. We do have restrictions over 7 Department of Energy or National Nuclear Security Administration sites, but your average nuclear site, sir, is not held by a federal entity.
Okay, thanks. Doug?
So basically she's saying, hey, if you want to go dive a nuclear site, there's nothing to stop you. That's not cool. We definitely need to have some security in locations like that. I am for that. And the system that I was just talking about earlier would cover that issue and would cover a lot of the other issues that they're talking about. Like I said, Apple has a way to identify machines that are coming into its airspace, its own private airspace. Apple has a way to do that. Now, if Apple can do that at their mothership over the hill in San Jose and Cupertino, why can't they do that on nuclear sites? I mean, yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My apologies to committee members of the panel. I was gone for the vast majority of this with another hearing having markup votes, so I hope what I ask isn't too redundant. But I appreciate your appearance here and opportunity. I come from far northern California, a very rural area.
Oh, hey, got a Northern California guy here. Finally, maybe he'll say something good.
Travel through there. A lot of levees, several dams. So this UAS or drone technology is very and can be very, very helpful and capable in making inspections and the type of eye in the sky you would need to do a better job of inspecting these things more often. Obviously, we're a very fire-prone area going through it right now with the season upon us. And, you know, power lines were blamed and maybe unfairly blamed last year for a lot of it. So the technology is very important, and its expansion and utilization is key, I think, to doing a better job on all these types of infrastructure. But they're also vulnerable to others that would like to cause harm or mayhem as well.
Who is causing harm and mayhem? Seriously. If there were a bunch of pilots causing harm and mayhem, and this was a legitimate problem, I would say yes, we need laws and regulations, and we need all this stuff. But we've been doing this safely for years. Several people on this committee have admitted that modelers have been doing it safe for years. Adding new rules and regulations is not going to change that. It's only going to create more barriers for modelers, and it's not going to keep the people that are doing bad stuff from doing bad stuff.
So if someone wanted to damage power lines or, you know, use this to somehow start fires or what have you,
that is a legitimate concern. I do worry about long-range pilots starting fires with their rigs.
What kind of counter drone technology is available, or methods, or regulatorily available to protect from those that would be using drones inappropriately or, you know, for criminal activity? What could be done to basically shoot them down and things of that nature?
Right now, sir, because of the nature of the counter-UAS technology that's out there, the vast majority of it has significant legal implications. That is, there's constraints for anyone but a few select federal entities to be able to utilize it. So that's sort of the legal hurdle to it. But secondarily, as we discussed a little bit earlier, much of the technology, particularly when we're talking about radio frequency-based technology, jamming and things of that nature, have spillover effects to the aviation spectrum, to both manned and legitimate unmanned aircraft. So the approach has been, at least with congressional direction to take a very slow and judicious approach to using that in the airspace. We do understand the concerns of critical infrastructure owners, certainly about the potential risks, not only from a security perspective, but also a safety perspective. As you said, they can crash into power lines, they can crash into sensitive facilities. Section 2209 of the 2016 FAA Reauthorization Act directed the Secretary of Transportation to put a process in place by which some of the UAS flight restrictions that I was speaking to Representative Norton about earlier could be requested and put in place for critical infrastructure owners. And we're working on that rulemaking right now. So it would enable a dam owner, a hydroelectric plant owner to petition the FAA to put up a flight restriction for UAS over their facility. And again, with the
better all go dive your dams now, because the FAA is putting in place legislation that'll keep that from happening in the future. We're losing our sky. We're losing our places to surf.
The education and the proper regulatory environment to ensure that all UAS operators are aware of and hopefully comply with that, those
NERC ruining the hobby.
challenges should dissipate as well. Again, looking forward, we hope that counter-UAS technology will continue to mature and evolve, and hopefully we will have some technologies that don't have as many spillover impacts that might be available in the future for other users that will not create the types of impacts we're seeing with the technology available today.
So you termed it as an FAA standby situation, right? With ability to actually counter some of the illicitly used drones? Is that kind of you're talking about also a regulatory zone or overlay too, but how about something more aggressive if there indeed is some type of a physical threat?
Obviously, right now, again, taking any action against a UAS, which is classified as an aircraft, is technically a violation of Title 1832. So from that perspective, again, the authority to do that only rests with a very few federal agencies.
Yeah, I understand.
So that is not an option that's available to a normal protective detail in charge of a critical infrastructure facility, for example.
So a federal agency on or near the site, for whatever reason, isn't quite equipped to do much of that yet?
They're not certain. In fact, not only are there only a few agencies, but those that are like DOD and DOE can only protect their facilities. They don't have the authority to protect other facilities at this time. There is the bill that was offered out of the House Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee does provide the opportunity, perhaps if DHS and Justice are given authority, to protect things like mass gatherings, or if there's a specific threat, to be requested by the state governor or attorney general to be able to provide support to a non-federal facility. But again, right now, because of the nature of the counter-UAS technology, there's a very judicious approach that's being taken to enabling the authorities to be able to use that type of technology because of the impacts.
Have you heard of much of this happening so far in the use of drones, not just recreational drones in the wrong place at the wrong time, but people using them fairly to any amount on infrastructure or for vandalism, or has that become a thing yet?
Certainly, our security partners and Steve could tell you, we've seen overseas some use of UAS in a intentional malicious manner by terrorist groups. There's a whole spectrum of threats associated with the malicious use of UAS, everything from surveillance to cyber attacks and other things as well. We have not seen that materialize here in the United States.
So she's like, we haven't seen these bad things happen, so we should definitely have laws, regulations, and tools to stop it from ever happening.
There have been one or two disrupted plots, but it is the concern that looms, on the horizon for our security partners.
Okay. Mr. Mucklow, would you like to touch on that as well from your perspective?
Yes, sir. Just a couple of points. First, I want to, share our concern and support to your state for the wildland firefighting efforts that are happening in Northern California. And just as a point I want to make about that is that the Secretary Mattis just recently authorized the use of an MQ-9 UAS to support the assessment efforts in support of those firefighters on the ground. So the Department of Defense certainly recognizes the utility of UAS in our airspace, but we also do it with a certificate of authorization from the FAA, meaning we've got the airspace to do it in a lawful way. But turning that to a counter UAS discussion, as Ms. Stubblefield talked about, it's a combination of capabilities that we apply, and we do it from an installation perspective. And we have, and I can't talk to the specifics of how we do it because that's a classified discussion, which I would certainly like to talk to you at any time in a classified setting about how we implement that. But it's done centrally to support the defense of critical assets within installations so as to reduce the risk that we may impose if we use specific RF capability that could be a safety issue in the U.S. national airspace. So that's our general approach. Going to your threat discussion, if we were to have a discussion in a classified setting, I could show you some potential discussion relative to use that we've seen, and that's related to ISIS planning and efforts to go on overseas and how that may be used for application within the United States, which we haven't seen materialize yet, but certainly there's classified briefings that could give you full insight into that capability that continues to develop and emerge and that we're very watchful of.
And forest fire being a tool that some of those types of organizations are looking at to cause mayhem in our 50 states. So I don't know how we're doing on time, sir, but just lastly, maybe if you could.
Well,
got 15 more minutes of this.
Excuse me.
Yes, sir.
We're pretty generous.
Okay, thank you. I don't see a clock, so I can't tell. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay.
Dan.
Thank you. I'll make this very quick. Ask Ms. Stubblefield, and you sort of touched on this a little bit, and this is probably
he definitely is a reptile
discussion. But has the FAA looked at what current regulations are in place that will need to be changed in order to permit the use of some counter UAS technology?
I'm sorry.
She's like, what?
Right. Part 91 really
love this.
When it says an individual cannot interfere with the flight crew, you could say, well, counter UAS technology, would be prohibited by Part 91. Are there other regulations? Is FAA, as you're going through this, looking at what regulations are now on the books that may need to be changed, revised in order to permit counter UAS technology?
Within the FAA, we have not.
There is nothing that needs to be changed to allow them to use counter UAS technology. There is absolutely nothing that needs to be changed for them to allow UAS technology to track and to find out who is flying those machines. There is nothing that they have to change to allow that to happen. There's nothing in the laws that has to change. I'm just being really clear on that.
Taking the specific look at our regulations, but there are a number of federal statutes that are implicated by the use of counter UAS. Many of them in Title 18, as I referenced earlier, 32, which prevents disruption or destruction of an aircraft.
How about this? You find out where the pilot is, you go to the pilot and you tell the pilot to land the plane or the aircraft or the drone or whatever have you, and then you deal with it. See, this is the thing. If you're on an airplane and say you commit a crime, the police will meet your stupid butt at the airport when you land. They're not going to put a jet up in the sky and try to board your plane while you're flying and fucking handcuff you at the controls. That's stupid and asinine and unsafe. So you identify where the operator is, you go to the operator, and you're like, well, we have the operator and their drone is up. Tell them to land the drone. And if they don't, then it's obviously like another crime of like reckless endangerment if they don't, and they just crash it or something. So like, it's just so asinine that they're talking about having new laws and regulations to be able to take the drones out of the sky, which could cause even more problems.
There's the Wiretap Act, the Computer Fraud.
Wiretap Act, you don't have to do that. You don't have to worry about that. Intercepting an open air signal is fine. You don't have to decrypt it.
Abuse and a number of others, and then there's the aircraft piracy in in Title 49 as well. when the grants of authority have been given, like to DOD and DOE, and I can certainly get back to you from our general counsel's office a clearer answer, but we have not at this point seen the need to change our regulatory mechanisms or our rules when that particular grant has been given at the federal level with exemption from those laws like Title 18 and 49, sir. But I'm happy to get back to you with a
I just want to make sure we're not running into those issues that we're looking at all of it right now. Is this new technology coming in? So, thank you.
Sir.
You good, Dan? Peter? Andre said he said he didn't have any questions. Oh, okay. Peter?
Ms. Stubblefield, as I mentioned earlier, there are two somewhat different approaches proposed in the FAA reauthorization regarding, the Section 336. So, could you give the FAA's view on these? I've listened to my colleagues, and I don't understand. I mean, first off, does the FAA want to go out there and ground model aircrafts, and people have been sophisticated and understand the rules and have been doing this for years? And do you want to adopt regulations that would somehow impede their hobby?
Let's hear what they say.
Sir, I can categorically say we do not.
Okay.
Yay!
But apparently they don't believe that. So we want to create, as I understand it, and I want you to comment on this, the Sanford Amendment essentially creates yet another category. Now the question is, how do we determine who's in that category versus the exempt category?
This is a good question.
I just bought my little toy Chinese drone.
This is what we've been waiting for.
I'm 336. I'm not a toy drone guy who doesn't know there's restricted airspace. How would that work? How are you going to
finally someone sensible?
How are you going to determine who's in category 3 and category 1?
Congressman DeFazio, that is a valid question, sir. The challenge with 336 and a proliferation, I guess, as you'd put it, of different categories of users is that confusion that we currently have will continue. Because again, we're dealing with individuals coming into the airspace who by and large are not
and earlier in this talk, she grouped up individuals. We don't know if they're threats. We don't know. We just assume they're threats. So you're grouping up those people that don't know what they're doing into that, and they're creating this confusion.
Pilots, they're not airspace users. And so their confusion about what the capability of their particular aircraft is, if they're meeting the requirements of 336, we have that confusion now, and that confusion will continue as long as we are unable to definitively and very clearly from the FAA say all UAS have to meet certain requirements: registration, remote identification, and a basic set of safety rules.
Just heard that.
The FAA had authority to regulate modelers prior to 2012, and we did not do so in a heavy-handed manner.
Because it wasn't needed.
And we certainly have no intention of doing that going forward. However, we do have the authority for the FAA to be able to keep pace with the operational environment and ensure that there are operational requirements that will enable modelers to operate in places that is commensurate with the air traffic environment in which they'd be operating, namely in controlled airspace and airspace restrictions. We would need to ensure that they operate there such that they're not potentially causing a safety or a security constraint that will wreak havoc in the system. And just as the very first car users didn't have a lot of rules, as more and more cars came on the streets, we had to have regulation about it. If we had in our
because cars were killing people.
Traffic system on the ground today, cars that didn't have to abide by rules, we would very quickly find ourselves in a very dangerous and unstable situation.
But we're not in a dangerous and unstable situation. This is the thing that's really pissing me off about this whole thing, is that we're not there. There's not people dying every day from erratic drones causing mayhem.
And that's our concern for the national airspace system, as long as we have those who are not under the same basic set of rules for complying with operational requirements in certain areas.
Adding new rules is not going to stop someone from flying illegally.
Do you think there's any modeler out there who couldn't meet those 3 requirements? Of course, now they don't have to have remote identification, but I mean, who couldn't meet those requirements?
The FAA would certainly work, as we are with our regulation, in a performance-based fashion to enable all users to be able to try to meet those in as least a burdensome way as possible.
Right. I think the concern here is the toy manufacturers are worried that if their purchasers had to take a knowledge test, that they might fail or not want to do it, or it impede them from buying one because they find out they're going to have to take a knowledge test. I would suggest strongly to the modelers, if they're listening, sever yourselves from the toy manufacturers. We are not going to interfere with your hobbies, but we have to be sure that all these other hundreds of thousands, potentially millions of people purchasing these things, which can take down a commercial aircraft,
that hasn't happened,
or hitting a vertical stabilizer, we've found out, at a very light weight, are knowledgeable to some extent, are registered, and are identifiable when they're operating like I've had to have firefighting operations taken down in my district because some jerk is flying their toy drone in the firefighting operation.
And more often than not, that jerk is found and he's reprimanded.
And I think it's happened in Mr. LaMalva's district also. We need to...
It has, and those jerks are found and they're dealt with.
Know who these people are.
And yes, we do. We find them and we shame them.
And we're going to prosecute them.
They have been.
There are laws against this stuff.
There are already laws against this stuff.
So I suggest those responsible users out there, sever yourselves from this defective amendment that Mr. Sanford offered. Thank you. That's the end of mine.
I love it. I love it. That dude just dropped the mic.
You should tell us how you really feel, Peter. Do we monitor what other countries are doing?
He's just walking out. He dropped the motherfucking mic and he walked out. Dude!
Yes, sir.
That was baller!
Perspective, both certainly on the regulatory side. We have in close contact with our colleagues in Canada, in Australia, in Europe, and in fact through ICAO as well. Obviously, unmanned aircraft systems are not unique to the United States, and that has become an ever-growing area of coordination and discussion in ICAO. So we are certainly looking at that. Similarly, in the counter environment,
I got excited on that
one. Mr. Mucklow can speak to that as well. We're certainly looking at, and in fact have sent FAA representatives to visit certain places where counter UAS technology has been used to understand their concepts of operations, what impacts they're seeing, so that, again, we can share that information.
Yes, sir. And just to add from a DoD perspective, yes, we absolutely do. And in fact, Deputy Secretary Shanahan just directed the establishment of an organization that is specifically...
Yeah, so for those that just missed it, the guy was like, this is all bullshit. You guys are trying to do something that doesn't really need to be done, and that all these modelers have to separate themselves from the commercial coalition and to basically go their own way. And then he dropped the mic and walked out. That was one of the most baller things I've seen on video in a while. He made some very good points, but he also made some very not so good points in my mind. But that was awesome. You should all go back and watch that.
Charged to look at capabilities that can be further used to combat this UAS problem. And that has taken into account some applications that we use overseas where we can test more rapidly and implement that within the United States in a quicker way. And so we're looking at not only what DoD does overseas, but also how other users from across the nations, in the other countries, are actually applying counter-UAS capability to apply that to the most effective capabilities that can be employed within DoD.
So it's not necessarily counter UAS, but it's pretty bothersome when we have some very major and significant companies that feel that they can't get the authorities to do their research and development.
That's a problem. That's a really big problem for companies getting authority to do what they need to do in the United States for drones.
It's not because they don't want to comply. It's just because of the confusion that's been created. So I hope as we move along with this, we understand that for us to be the leader in this and continue to be the leader, we need to encompass it all. Rick, you have anything?
It's true. He said some really good stuff.
On DoD and DOE. Could you remind me at least? Did we identify any particular number of facilities in the authorization in the NDAA, or was it just a broader authority?
It's a broader authority and it's related to specific mission areas. So any facilities that are supporting specific mission areas is authorized by Congress, and there's 9 of them total, and they're all related to those most critical applications of the Defense Department. So those facilities that support those 9 mission areas could employ counter-UAS capabilities. And right now we're looking at a very focused look at all the facilities and what we may want to seek in the area of additional authorities beyond what we already have, again, based on those critical assets we need to defend. And so we'll have those results to the Secretary here very soon. And we appreciate Congress's continued support of our examination of our present authorities and what we may seek in the future.
Ms. Stubblefield, in the proposed language in the Senate that's trying to get into the NDAA, is the FAA comfortable that the mission list for DOJ and DHS is specific enough or not?
Yes, we are comfortable, and one of the primary reasons we're comfortable is because the same coordination mechanisms and requirements that are in the NDAA for us to work with DoD and DOE are replicated in that bill as well.
Do we use the same language? The language in the Senate bill they're seeking to incorporate talks about consulting with the FAA when it is determined that aviation safety and such is. But it doesn't actually say that the FAA gets to determine if aviation safety is impacted. It sort of leaves it wide open about who gets to determine.
I think the language is actually if there's the possibility that it may be impacted.
I've got the language that says shall coordinate both for testing and for any rules or regs. Shall coordinate when it with the administrator when it might affect aviation safety, civilian aviation, aerospace operations, and so on and so on and so on. It doesn't actually put it in the FAA's hands to make that determination.
This is a very, very good point.
But if you go further into the bill, sir, at the end there's a discussion over the risk assessment.
Yeah.
And that risk assessment is very much where you see the connectivity between DHS and Justice and the FAA in working through.
So you're suggesting the risk assessment mechanism takes place first?
Yes, sir.
That's what FAA says.
And use it, and we have actually in advance of the administration's proposal a set of counter UAS implementation principles that DHS and Department of Justice signed up to that talk about the myriad of ways there will be coordination when you put any type of technology into the national airspace system. There is an impact to operations, and therefore we're very comfortable because the language is very much what you see as well in the NDAA, that the FAA's coordination role is suitably.
I want to say that the DOJs that in my 18 years, they've been bipartisan in their efforts to bypass other agencies. Yes. So I'm not as confident as you are on this. So. Does the FAA have an estimate of the number of facilities that might be impacted? DOJ and DHS might ask about.
No, the DHS and Justice.
Yeah, the risk assessment is pretty pointless because there's been literally almost zero risk
on an assessment of where they think they would like to start. Or what facilities they think would fall into the categories that are identified in the legislation. And we have not, talked with them further because that would be their first cut. And then we would get into that risk assessment of, okay, what's the air traffic around it? What type of technology would you want to use? And then that's where that coordination and conversation would be to determine if, in fact, those are appropriate facilities.
Two facilities in with the DOD after a year.
Sir?
Is this a multi-decade project? It just doesn't seem unless there's more staffing, more people.
Again, they're basically alluding to the fact that there has to be a drone agency. He's like, you guys are trying to do something that requires way more resources than you have, and it's nearly impossible to do what you want to do because you don't have the resources to do half of it. So what is your plan on that?
Effort. If you're ever adding 2 additional agencies.
You just said it. You just said it. It feels like you're adding additional agencies.
Well, there's a couple of things. One, that slow or length of time is representative of that deliberative process, but it also is a representative of creating the foundation. So as we create that foundation, which we're also using with DOE and would also be using with Justice and Homeland, should they get grants of authority, a lot of that work has been done. So DOD did a lot of the hard work with us that we'll be able to use that will hopefully expedite. So we should be down to working on the more site-specific stuff. And even with DOD, once we lock in those foundational pieces of guidance, concepts of operation, notification procedures, then moving site to site goes much more quickly. There is a workload impact, certainly, sir.
I have one more question. How do you thought, maybe you can answer this, since our facilities use a lot of private security contractors for security. Is this something that, if it becomes operable, if they have to use counter UAS, is it somebody in a uniform paid for directly by the taxpayer who makes a decision to deploy counter UAS, or is this something we let private security contractors on bases do?
At this point, it's in the hands of military personnel that are making that determination. And certainly from a command and control perspective, the decision making is within the military only. There's been no established contracted support to operate this capability. And to the point on the 2.
Well, that's good. I hope that lesson is taken when we go to DOJ and DHS. We've got private contractors running private prisons here in the United States. And I prefer that if we're going this route, that we've got people who are paid directly by the U.S. taxpayer rather than through a contract, having this authority, rather than let private prison personnel use that authority.
He's basically like, we've got to make sure that idiots don't have the ability to use this technology.
And any other facility as well. Thank you.
You good?
I'm good.
I'm good here. Drop the mic, and he walks off.
Okay, well, this has been, I think, very helpful.
No, move the mic. The technical term is they move it away.
For your expertise, I thank you for being here today, and we stand adjourned. Thanks.
Woo! Yeah, that was awesome, kind of. So I'm going to mute this and kind of talk about what we just watched for a couple minutes before I end the live stream. Thank you all for watching with me. That was quite interesting. Obviously, a lot of what they're talking about is not directly related to hobby use. That being said, a lot of the stuff they brought up, without them realizing, affects hobbyists in a lot of ways. And it's really interesting to see the kind of people that are making the decisions behind the scenes and are trying to put drones in their place, so to speak. It's really kind of disheartening, some of the ideas they had about implementing like registration system on the drones, or like a Part 107 light for people that are operating as a hobbyist but don't have a license. So they talked about licensing hobbyists. It's funny. One of the, I believe, senators or congresspeople, they're basically like, okay, listen, hobbyists need to basically get away from you guys because you aren't helping them. Like, the coalition, they're talking about a hobby grade license for people to use. They're talking about like restricting areas where pilots can fly. They've talked about restricting pilots flying in only certain locations, i.e. like parks. There was so much they brought up that even though they weren't directly talking about hobbyists, they were still talking about stuff that's going to relate to us and stuff that's going to affect us. So even though this is more on the defense end of rogue drones and not, hobbyists, it still affects us. So yeah, and as Squishy says, are you still a hobbyist if you have a license? I don't think so. And like one of the other people brought up, there are aircraft operating in the airspace without tail numbers and without having any licensing whatsoever. Like giant gliders and stuff are in the airspace, and nothing has been a problem with that. And as some of the committee had even said, that hobbyist drones have not been a problem. In the same tone, in the same time, they're like, we need to create new laws and regulations for hobbyist drones. And it's just really upsetting. If anything, there needs to be new laws and regulations created for commercial drones for those people to do what they need to do. Because it is obvious that commercial entities are hindered from doing the research and R&D that they want here in the United States, so they do it elsewhere. So there's a lot of hindrance already in the laws and regulations in place in the United States that's keeping commercial interests from doing what they need to do. And realistically, this board is more about allowing commercial interest into the airspace versus hobbyists, and then allow them what to do if there are rogue drones. So yeah, I really think all they have to do is add a identification system, basically pinpoint where the drone is and where the operator is. And that kind of technology already exists and is already available to government people. Like a private citizen can go out and buy this identification technology right now. Apple is already using it on their campus to good success to track down people that are flying over their campus to get video. So it's kind of upsetting that they're talking about creating new laws and regulations to deal with this issue when it's not a problem. They're creating a problem out of thin air, and it's very disgusting to see that. And I really, really hope that whatever does come of all this is more sensible than half the stuff they brought up. So, yeah, I would say contact your local legislator. We all have to be outstanding members of the community right now. As the FAA and certain coalitions are looking to repeal 336, we really have to be on the ball to make sure that our rights as hobbyists and as enjoyers of the national airspace can continue to enjoy that airspace and continue to enjoy the rights of flying where we like to fly. So yeah, contact your local state representatives, make sure they know that you love drones and that you want to make sure that you have a place to fly them, because if we don't start coalescing right now, if you don't start supporting that industry, then we're going to potentially lose it. And So Many Green says, was the AMA even at the table today? No, there was nobody representing hobbyists at the table today. There's nobody representing the 200,000 people that routinely fly drones and other RC models in their airspace. So one of the largest groups of people was not represented there. And that was disappointing. Although there was several times and questions where they brought up how is this going to affect the modelers that have been doing it safely. Several of them were they're trying to say, hey, modelers are not the problem. Where the subcommittee were saying, hey, modelers are not the problem, but we want laws and regulations for them. Whereas the rest of them that were actually interrogating the subcommittee, they're like, hey, wait a second, we don't need new laws and regulations. Besides one lady from Representative Washington, D.C. She's very against drones. So yeah, it's really interesting to see the kind of conversation that happened today. If you're just tuning in now, I urge you to go back and watch the whole thing. It was really interesting and very illuminating to see what the people in power have to think about drones and what they're doing to implement anti-UAS technologies into the national airspace system. So yeah, I think that's about it, and I think I'm going to end it here. Thank you all for watching. It's been an interesting thing. As more of these subcommittee hearings pop up around UAS and stuff, I think I'm going to try to re-live stream them with commentary, because this kind of stuff is kind of needed. We have to be able to talk about some of these issues, so hopefully going forward we're not affected by them negatively. The time to act and talk about these things is now, not later. And I really believe that as a group of people, we can make sure that the airspace remains open and friendly to aero modelers for years to come. So thank you for watching. I've been Zoe FPV, and until next time,